Namaste, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center, London. Now, some may think of Nehru Center as just this beautiful fine building, and it is a fine building, no doubt. We have a wonderful art gallery out here. We have an awesome auditorium on the first floor with a capacity of 100 to 120 people right here in the heart of central London in Mayfair. But the Nehru Center is a lot more than this fine building. The Nehru Center is also an online platform. We are available on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on YouTube. And so the Nehru Center is actually wherever you want it to be. Of course, we'd love for you to come to the physical events that we organize out here when we do organize them. But do join all our online platforms as well. This is a hybrid world. We are going to have offline physical events and online events as well. So do join our online platforms and do keep giving us feedback of what you think of it. We'd love to host you out there. We'd love to hear what you think of our events, and do keep sending in your suggestions as well. We do keep imbibing and learning from the feedback that you give to us to give you programs that you guys might enjoy. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Namaste. Jai Hind. Namaste, my name is Amish Tripathi. As you just saw in the video prior, I'm the director of the Nehru Center. And as you guys are all aware, of course, our physical programs are on, and we are delighted to see you attend our events in large numbers. But our online programs continue as well. And this is a multinational online program with two friends joining in from India and me joining in from London. And I'm delighted with this program that we are putting up. This is the launch of Kautilyanomics for modern times. The author, Sriram Balasubrananian, will be joining us soon, and he'll be in conversation with Sanjeev, Sanyal, both my friends and both brilliant scholars whose thoughts and words I deeply respect. If you could bring up Sriram and Sanjeev up on stage, please.
Namaste.
Hi, namaste Sriram. Namaste Sanjeev. How are you?
Namaste.
Doing well, Amish.
We are well.
I'm delighted to welcome you guys, but I'm sorry, this is a Sarkari place, so I have to do the formal introductions before we jump into the conversation. Sriram, you have to get used to it. Sanjeev, you're used to Sarkari stuff already. Okay. So let me first introduce Sriram, the author of Kautilyanomics. Sriram Balasubrananian is a well-known economist and author. His areas of interest include global macroeconomics, socio-economic trends in emerging markets, and Indian Dharmic culture. He's written for several international publications such as Bloomberg, Foreign Policy, Wall Street Journal, and Fox EU, among others, as an independent columnist, and has been an independent panelist on CNBC TV 18. He's authored 2 books, Jamba, The Joint Family, and The Wizards, which has been featured in varied publications, including The Hindu. He used to be an international junior chess player and is an alumnus of Columbia University, New York. Sriram, absolute pleasure being here. I am delighted to have someone on stage who I have liked, whose work I've admired, and whose books I've read. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming here.
Thanks, Amish. Really delighted to be part of this conversation. If you remember, we launched my first book in Mumbai almost 10 years back. I want to kickstart with one incident, if you don't mind.
But before that, if I may introduce Sanjeev as well. We are a Sarkari place. I need to finish the formalities. Sanjeev, Sanyal, like I said, it's a delight that I am introducing to people whose works I've admired, and Sanjeev Sanyal's works I've admired for a very long time. In fact, you could call me a fan. But let me do his formal introduction first. Sanjeev Sanyal is currently a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and Secretary to the Government of India. He was the Principal Economic Advisor to the Finance Minister for 5 years till Feb 2022. He has also represented India on many international forums such as OECD and G7 and was the co-chair of the G20's Framework Working Group. He was one of the main architects of the G20's Global Action Plan, which was used to coordinate the international response to the COVID 19 pandemic. Prior to joining the government, he spent over 2 decades in financial markets and was a global strategist and managing director at Deutsche Bank. An alumnus of Sriram College of Commerce, Delhi, Sanjeev later attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He has had many affiliations, including being a visiting scholar at Oxford University, an adjunct fellow at the University of Policy Studies, Singapore, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, London. I've seen many of his maps at home. He has a fantastic collection, among the best private collections I've seen. Didn't let me touch the maps though. Yeah,
Next time.
very
Next time.
okay. Visiting professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, senior fellow of the World Wildlife Fund. He was awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship in 2007 for his work on urban dynamics. That's another thing Sanjeev and I will share. We are both Eisenhower Fellows. In 2010, he was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in Davos. What a CV. But here comes the part that I'm a fan of. Sanjeev is the author of a number of best-selling books, including Land of the Seven Rivers, The Ocean of Churn, India and the Age of Ideas, and the Indian Renaissance. He has co-authored and edited 6 economic surveys of the Government of India between 2017 and 2022. He has also published over 200 articles and columns in leading national and international publications. What a delight and honor to have the two of you out here. Thank you. Thank you so much for gracing Nehru Center with your presence.
Thank you, Amish, for that. Now we have to live up to that introduction. So,
But
first of all, thank you for
But
hosting us on Nehru
before we
Center.
start further, I'm so sorry
Yeah.
to cut it again. The stage will be yours, Sanjeev. You'll be the one grilling Sriram. But we are here to launch a book,
Yes, that's
and
true. Let's not forget
since
that.
this is an online program, we don't get the pleasure of ripping wrapping paper and all that. What we do get is the pleasure of an online launch video. Sriram, I hope you enjoy this. Our tech team has put this together. The launch of your book. Can that be played, please? The video. Thank you. And this is what will go up on our social media. You hold the book up, Sriram. Sanjeev, you can just say Kautilyanomics loudly or something.
Kautilyanomics. My copy is lying still at home, so
Thank you.
Sanjeev, I promise to hand over the stage to you. You're going to drive the conversation. But with your permission, may I ask one question to Sriram before you take the
sure.
conversation forward? Yeah. So there's something that really intrigued me, Sriram, when I started reading your books, and I of course I'm not as well read as my elder sister or as Sanjeev or you, but I read a lot. I read 5 6 books a lot, and I get delighted when I read 5 6 books per month on average, and I get delighted when I discover something that I'd never heard of before. And you spoke of the pre-Kautilyan 5 principles of sustainable development that India had, and I'd never heard of this. Can you just expand on that a bit?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Amish, and to Sanjeev for being part of this. Both of you have been very integral to my sort of journey as a writer. In fact, my first book, Sanjeev was the first one to read the book and give me a blurb for the book. And Amish was the one who launched it in Mumbai. And I wanted to mention this incident before I get to your answer. Because in Mumbai, Sanjeev, we had this launch. It was a very rainy day. So we had very few people for the event. It was just 5 or 6 of us for the event. And here was Amish Tripathi, India's best-selling author, who has millions of followers, who was there through the event, somehow sort of helped me through the entire process, and was kind enough to launch the entire book. 10 years later, I still feel, grateful for that support. And Amish has been a great support, and I really wanted to thank him for everything
Thank
as
you.
well.
Thank you so much, Sriram.
Yeah.
I am always delighted to support books that I love. We need more thinkers. We need more people bringing out the wonderful the heritage and treasure of knowledge that all of us Indians have inherited from our ancestors. I'm delighted you're doing more work in this space. Now to my answer.
Yeah, sure. So th- this is the first chapter of the book, right? I mean, one of the principal sort of ideas which came about in my research was that a lot of Kautilya's thoughts, he himself admits that it came from a prior time, in the sense he felt it was an accumulation of thoughts from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and lot of other scriptures, and he sort of aggregated everything and then brought in some of his ideas as well. So in that context, we wanted to sort of give that flavor to the reader, and I had co-authored this with Professor Satish Deodar, where we talk about sort of a 5-pillar model, which prior civilizations sort of had from our point of view. One is the idea of dharma, right? I mean, that served as fundamental even during prior times, where the dharmic pillar was attributed to economic well-being
Yes.
in those times, economic and social well-being,
Yeah.
and then the
From the
idea of
dharma, artha,
collective.
karma, moksha, the purushartha.
That's right.
Four
Yeah. The
purushartha.
main Purusharthas, which is Artha, Kama, Dharma, Moksha. And then within the Purusharthas, we talk about Dharma being the fountainhead of welfare,
Yes.
which sort of determines, economic and social well-being. And then you come to the idea of responsibilities, right? The citizens' collective responsibilities, which had a pillar of governance, and the idea of wealth creation and pleasure seeking as part of the artha and kama sort of pillars, and then the idea of market facilitation, which we have given examples, say, from the text in the Mahabharata, Ramayana, and Vedic literature, and also lastly the pillar of institutional capacity. The idea of money creation, taxation, what some of these things were there in those pillars. So the the fundamental premise is that the way of life, what we call as the Dharmic way of life, was essentially the base of the sustainable sort of growth model, which we refer in that first chapter. And not surprisingly, that sort of pivots onto the book, into the various other chapters. So this is a quick summary of of that part, Amish. Because one point is that despite the sort of spiritual angle of all the earlier text, which we have debated, discussed, and talked about, millions of times, I think there's also a sort of a materialistic angle to normal life in those times, and this sort of tries to create a structure to that angle. I would say.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Now I am gonna leave the stage as promised, Sanjeev, and I'm gonna leave it to you, and I'm gonna watch it from the sidelines. So, Sanjeev, over to you. I'm gonna leave.
Thank you very much, Amish. And as I was saying earlier, thank you for hosting both me and Sriram and on this platform at Nehru Center. Um, of course, let me begin, of course, by thanking and congratulating Sriram for this book, Kautilyanomics for Modern Times. And there are two parts to it. One is obviously the point about Kautilya, who is a 2,300-year-old scholar who wrote this book. And then is, of course, the association with modern times. So these are the two themes of this book. So let me very quickly summarize. I mean, for those who are not familiar with Kautilya, who was Kautilya and why is his book so interesting? It's interesting because in some ways it is the oldest extant book, which is a comprehensive book on governance, written by somebody who was himself a major character in his time. So Kautilya, or otherwise known as Chanakya, lived in the third and fourth centuries BC, and he was basically first of all a scholar in Takshila University, but then he later on, famously with the help of his disciple Chandragupta, created India's first great empire. In fact, the Mauryan Empire would go on to become one of the greatest empires of all time in human history. So this is not a person who is just theoretician, unlike many other scholars he sometimes gets compared to. Also, the interesting about Kautilya's book Arthashastra, which is the main text that has survived, is the fact that it's only not about economics, although that is something we will focus on, but it's a general book on governance. So it has everything on how to put together a city. It has got obviously on economics, how to issue currency, taxation, and all these kinds of things. But it also talks about geostrategic issues, how to set up spy systems. In fact, this business about spies very often picks up such a lot of attention that and this business about how to maintain power, that very often that part of the discussion gets spinned off, and it's he's very often said to be this book is compared to The Prince, which it is not. The Prince is a very limited book about power, whereas the Arthashastra is a much wider book, and it's not just got philosophy. It has practical rules of thumb, actual codes on how to go about doing certain things. Some in certain areas very, very detailed, on how to say set up a taxation system, or how to provide punishments for certain kinds of activities, and so on. So it's a very interesting book which provides a wide-ranging landscape of a person's thinking. And as Sriram pointed out, this did not happen out of thin air. There was already an existing schools of thought that existed. Of course, there were the Mahabharata, Ramayana, and the religious cultural texts. But of course, Kautilya himself mentions other writers, like, for example, Brihaspati and the school of Shukra and the school of Manu, and so on. So, and he talks about them, and in many, many places, what is interesting, he says, so and so scholar said this, and another scholar said that, and I think that this one is right and that one is wrong. So, he very much situates himself as part of a chain, and he's not kind of sort of claiming to be sort of the beginning or font of this. There's already an existing corpus of knowledge and debate, and Kautilya clearly situates himself in that chain. What is also interesting is that he says that governance requires 4 fields of knowledge, and they are Dandaniti, Varta, Trai, and Anvikshiki. And here in this context, it's important to know what these are, and I'll just illustrate how these different schools differ from each other. So there is Dandaniti. Dandaniti is law, the legal system, enforcement of contracts, that sort of thing. Varta is economic policy, or generally policy more broadly, socio-economic policy. Anvikshiki is a philosophical framework, and Trai is the cultural context. So then he goes on and says that different schools of thought place greater emphasis on different areas of knowledge. So just to give you a sense, the school of Shukra seems to place a great amount of emphasis on Dandaniti and not on the other areas of knowledge. Dandaniti is on the force of law. Brihaspati, on the other hand, thinks that both Dandaniti and Varta, which is policy, are important. Then there is the school of Manu, which thinks that Dandaniti is important, Varta is important, but also thinks that Trai and Anvikshiki, which is cultural context and philosophical context, also matter. But interestingly, Manu thinks the philosophical context and cultural religious context are essentially the same thing. And then there is Kautilya, who says, yes, Dandaniti is important, that is, law is important, policy is important. But then he says, Trai and Anvikshiki are somewhat separate things, which is the religious cultural context is important, and one must know this, but also the philosophical context, which Kautilya separates out as being another area of knowledge. So all of this is quite interesting because it shows a fairly evolved way of thinking about thought and ideas that had already existed by the time Kautilya gets into the game. Just if you'll excuse me, my phone is ringing. Let me switch it off.
Sure.
Sorry about that, guys. Now, what we're going to do here is, why don't I bring Sriram into the conversation? And there's a whole bunch of questions I have for him. But the first question, which I'm going to ask him, is what is the context of this book? Why did you, write yet another? Some may ask you, yet another book on Kautilya. He's hardly a man who has not had books written about him. And so, why did you decide to go for it?
Yeah, thanks, Sanjeev, for the very nice summary of Kautilya's ideas. I think for your readers, your lecture at Gujarat University was also very good on a similar subject. I think where you sort of detailed this a bit more. But on your question, that's a very interesting question. I was for my own sort of economic research, I was working on Angus Madison's data set many years ago. So for the listeners, Angus Madison is a world-renowned economist, who's an economic historian, who has sort of compiled a data set for about 1,000 years on GDP growth and per capita growth and things like that over a period of 1,000 years across the world. So in that, most of us would know that India and China have been sort of growing, being the top sort of countries from the beginning of Common Era till about 17th century. So they've been exchanging places, but they've been sort of one of the top two countries. So in that context, I mean, some people dismiss this saying that, production and industrialization wasn't there, but so it's all a proxy of, say, population. But I sort of differed with that perspective. I mean, we have seen many scholars, many writers, travelers who've written books, Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, for example, who have written books on the legacy of Bharat during those times, and we have seen many empires. So my intuitive understanding was there is an economic framework here, which sort of was the base for some of this growth. And then I chanced upon, while learning Sanskritam part-time, I chanced upon the Arthashastra text itself. So these two sort of confluenced me into thinking about the framework. But once I started doing research on the Arthashastra, what I realized is that there's very little of the Artha in terms of the books that's come out, right? Most of the books that have come out are on Chanakya Niti, the political side of it, the strategic side of it, which you mentioned. Another group is the sort of motivational sort of, business self-help books. Another group is fiction, right? Very little was on economics of Kautilya in terms of, really solid research. There's one brilliant book by Balbir Sihag, which was published in, I think, 2014, which was more of an academic book. But other than that, I could find barely any sort of research. So that sort of triggered me to get into this and sort of try to bring a book which not only distills Kautilya's economic ideas, but provides a framework, an economic framework for his thinking, and then contextualize it to today's time so that people can debate and discuss. So I think that was sort of the context for this. And also, if you look at other civilizations, you take the Japanese have their own sort of version of stakeholder capitalism called Sapna Yoshi, for example. The Chinese have a lot of their civilizational sort of economic concepts, which they use even today. There's a brilliant paper, NBER paper, on ancient Chinese history and economic cycles, where the boom and bust cycles that we talk about today, how the ancient Chinese dealt with them and what are some of the principles that they used, and they're still using it now. But I found very little of, barely anything of Indian civilizational history and its economic contours, which can explain a lot of the things that's happening today. So that was an additional motivation to get out the subject and sort of get people to debate and discuss on these ideas.
And before I get into the content of the book, give us some sense of the challenges you faced while researching this. I mean, obviously, one, I don't know if you actually went and looked at the original in Sanskrit and tried to translate it, or did you use somebody else's translations? How did you research the historical context of the book, for example, and so on?
Yeah. So one of the main challenges is that this requires a multi-dimensional skill set, right? Because we're dealing with a very dense Sanskritam text, which is in many books, thousands of slokas. And then there are only like 3 or 4 major translations. One is by Shama Shastri in 1915, Kangle 3 versions in 1960s, and then Rangarajan in 1990, and then T.G. Shastri a bit earlier. So for all the talk on Kautilya and Chanakya, there are only about 4 to 5 major translations. And all of these folks, with due credit to them, are not subject matter experts in what we are dealing with, which is economics and finance. So what I had to do with was, first, I understand Sanskritam. I can, I'm not an expert, but I had to relearn and sort of work on my Sanskritam and work with Sanskritam scholars to go to the text. So, Dr. Sushruta is a professor at Amrita Vishwapith. He helped me with a lot of these quotations where we sort of go into the text, pick out areas where we feel there are economic principles discussed, and then sort of ideate on the translations. So that was one bucket of it, right? The second challenge is the economics and finance knowledge, which luckily I have. So sort of integrating both of these into sort of a framework. And the last challenge is to contextualize it to today's times, because you don't really want a theoretical construct. You want to sort of showcase to the reader in a fairly simple way, not complex econ lingo, in a simple way, how it contextualizes today's times. So these were sort of the 3 buckets of challenge in terms of doing the book. And then getting a publisher for the book is another sort of ball game, where you have to convince people that that this is a subject worth pursuing. I mean, nowadays I think the interest is much more on indigenous thinking, but I think Bloomsbury was very kind, and they saw the vision for the book, because it's not easy to see what the book can produce, purely on the ideas that I'm articulating for a publisher. So that was sort of the a challenge, and the last challenge is also the lack of research on the subject. So other subjects, you have a lot of material, a lot of literature that you can work, quote, and do all that. Whereas here, you don't have too much literature on this subject. So you had to, most of the ideas are sort of fairly new. And the ideas aren't new. I mean, they're in the text, but the frameworks are new. So it sort of required some original thinking, cross-checking with economists, Indologists, Sanskritam scholars, just to make sure they're in sync. So a lot of due diligence was done. So that's why it took a long time, because it's easy to write, for example, like op-eds about these subjects. It's very difficult to sort of go on the ground and sort of really dig deep into all this.
So, Sriram, you seem to sort of make a case for dharmic capitalism, or at least make the case that Kautilya was arguing for some sort of a dharmic capitalism. Now, there are 2 parts to this. One is Kautilya really arguing for any form of capitalism at all? I mean, is it, or are you making an ahistorical comparison? Secondly, even if he was, how is dharmic capitalism, let's say, different from Adam Smith's capitalism or the Washington consensus capitalism? In fact, why is it capitalism at all, and why is it dharmic at all?
Yeah, that's a very interesting. I mean, that's a good question again. I think the reason why because I was a bit reluctant to get the capitalism, sort of Dharmic capitalism quotation in the framework for a variety of reasons. Because I believe it has its own sort of indigenous flavor to it. You don't need capitalism to sort of frame Kautilya in that mold. But I think the set of ideas that he profused, and the fact that the book had to contextualize to something current, necessitated the need, for the idea of Dharmic capitalism. And we could define it as Dharmonomics. We could define it in other sort of lingo as well. So that was sort of
give me an example of something that Kautilya, by virtue of being a Dharmic capitalist, would do or not do, which Adam Smith or a more recent Washington consensus economist would disagree with, positively or negatively. What would he say that would be different from the run-of-the-mill capitalist?
See, the run-of-the-mill capitalists, or the general worldview of capitalism is you intervene either at the state or at the market, right? You have the state, big finance, big state, which pumps in money, say through stimulus, or you raise taxes, or you do other measures to sort of correct the economy, right? So that is one bucket of the Keynesian sort of worldview. And another bucket is the market. I mean, people believe that the free markets are liberating by themselves. They self-correct by themselves, and they sort of provide the solutions in the longer run, despite issues in the shorter run, if there are any issues. But I think what Kautilya insisted on is for Dharma to play this role of self-correcting mechanism, right? So, for example, if there is an issue with the state, say there is corruption, right? And because of corruption, there's an issue of delivery and welfare and efficiency being affected. So Kautilya felt that use of a dharma as a fundamental principle would help to sort of address this directly, rather than the state, rather than you creating a commission and because he believed that individual actions determine economic outcomes at an aggregate level, whether it is the state or the market. So if the individual sort of dharmic coefficient, if you can call it, is sort of addressed, then it solves the problems at both at the state and the market simultaneously. So instead of fixing both the state as well as the market, so that's why I sort of give three buckets. One is on ethics, another is on responsibilities, and another is on social sort of international harmony, which are three buckets of his worldview. So answering a question on what he would do compared to, say, Smith and others, I also argue that one of the pillars, outcomes of these pillars, the three buckets which I spoke about, is the idea of a non-intervening but strong state, sort of an internationally, a globalized sort of wealth creation. And the third bucket is sustainable growth. So in the bucket of sustainable growth, we talk about ideas like societal responsibilities and things like that, environmental responsibilities, which are sort of triggered by your dharmic consciousness, for example, right? But if you take things like Swachh Bharat, for example, you sort of create an incentive for people to sort of do things for the bigger picture, for the bigger good, through their dharmic awareness. I think that's what Kautilya would do, create these sort of nudges, which I think the modern capitalistic framework is trying to come to that, through the nudge theories and various other sort of principles. But Kautilya, I think, would do that in a more calibrated way, where he believed that sort of these individual behavioral sort of constructs helps to achieve big macroeconomic goals without being stuck in the binary between the state and the market.
So, of course, Kautilya was not debating either Adam Smith or today's economists. The debates of that time were different, and he, of course, mentions the debates that preceded him, and we discussed that, whether it's Brihaspati, Shukra, Manu, and so on. But it's interesting, the debate after him is also quite interesting, because the debate after him is then taken over by Ashoka, who is a very lively interventionist. And so, how would you, first of all, the context of the debate of the Mauryan court is the realist and the idealist. The realist in Kautilya and the idealist of Ashoka with a great belief in state intervention. Um, how would you do? How would you take that conversation? And of course, the legacy of that common conversation, because then there are other texts afterwards, like Kamandakya, Niti Sara, and so on, which take forward some of these ideas in different ways. Although my own view is Kamandak's Niti Sara is not of the same quality of thinking as Kautilya, but nevertheless, his legacy was still alive in the Gupta court, and many of these ideas were still being used. So, what would be? How would you situate Kautilya in the debates of his own time?
Yeah, I think you sort of hit it on the nail, right? In the sense that he was a complete realist. I mean, he was a political economist who had a very sort of um, uh, 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 very important understanding of what the people wanted. There is a brilliant quote, I think, which summarizes what Arthashastra is. I want to probably mention that quote because it goes like this: Praja sukhe sukam rajyaha, prajanam cha ite hitam, nat preyam hitam rajyaha, prajanam tu preyam it hitam. So it basically tells you that the king's happiness, this is what Kautilya says, king's happiness lies in the happiness of his subjects, and his welfare in the welfare of his subjects. The king's welfare consists not in what pleases him, but in what pleases his subjects. Right? So the premise of the Arthashastra in general is the welfare of the people, right? And it is
But
context agnostic.
Ashoka would make the same claim.
Yeah, but but the thing is, the Arthashastra itself is context agnostic. I think it doesn't, for example, give examples of how the Mauryan king or what the Mauryan king should do in the text. So it is set for a sort of an era which is far, which is agnostic of that particular era. I think Kautilya consciously did that because he didn't want his views to be sort of sullied by other political compulsions or whatever it is. So he wanted to sort of lay the text as it is. I think I agree with you that that subsequent thinkers like Ashoka had different sort of perspectives. I think Kautilya varied because his idea of state intervention was very different. His idea of the state is basically a state which is strong. If there are any punishments, it will be vigorous. It'll implement the rule of law very strictly, but it won't micromanage what an individual sort of does. It sort of allows individuals and players to sort of to do their commerce on the terms that they want. So I think they are different in that sense. And the second thing is on the point of subsequent works. There's in this book by R.C. Majumdar, he talks about in Kambujadesa in Cambodia that there are inscriptions of the Arthashastra in many of the temples within Cambodia. So his thinking spread much further even in the Common Era into a lot of these kingdoms. Where I come from, the south in Tamil Nadu, the Rajendra Cholas and the Rajaraja Cholas empires, which went through, which conquered many countries. A lot of their sort of thinking is based in a different sort of format to Kautilya, but the idea of, again, dharma resonates everywhere of why it was sort of important for them. So subsequent thinkers have also, I think, used his ideas. Probably they made modifications during those times according to what was needed, but they've also sort of used them extensively. So on the Ashoka comparison, I do agree with you. I think the Kautilyan, state sort of was very different. And in terms of subsequent works, I think not only do you see in more recent times of Chanakya's times, you also see in the Common Era, where a lot of his sort of ideas resonated with people.
So I'm going to take a couple of historical questions. And first of all, what is your sense of this book? Was this book written by Kautilya before he created the empire, or afterwards, after he had some experience at doing so? Because the book itself is, as he said, he writes it agnostic to his times to the extent he can. So, what is your thinking on this?
No, my thinking is the book. One thing that comes across the book very well is that it's a practical tool book, in the sense that it's written by someone who has practically implemented or seen the implementation of some of these ideas, right? And some of these ideas he thinks are firm. I mean, he has, like what you mentioned, he refers to Brihaspati. He sort of challenges a theoretical framework before. So it's a combination of both. My sense is this book would have been done, not before the conquest or the expansion of the empire, but perhaps in between, where he felt that he had this bunch of ideas, but because being in the realm of governance and government, he probably would have felt that he couldn't implement some of these ideas for a variety of reasons, right? And then he probably decided, okay, let me probably come to a position where I sort of put a book which is independent of all this, and then collate some of these ideas. But I think a more important point, which it sort of goes under the bus, is the civilizational continuity, right? Because I think what Kautilya tries to establish, with credit to him, is that he explicitly mentions the civilizational continuity of his ideas, and the fact that he's adding a layer to it, and then it goes off after that. So that is something which you don't find in other scriptures. I mean, people often compare Machiavelli to Kautilya, which I find quite problematic for a variety of reasons. One of the main reasons is that this is context agnostic. This is a continuity of civilizational, prior civilizational heritage, and which still exists after Kautilya, whereas Machiavelli was just for a particular king and it was just for a particular sort of construct. But yeah, my
So let me
thinking
take
is
up this
that,
point.
yeah,
Yeah, so let me take up this point about civilizational continuity, and we'll have some point, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, viewers, do get your questions ready, because in a little while we'll open it up to some of your questions as well. So I think you can type them out at the bottom, and we'll get some of them. Maybe I can ask one more question. Now, there is an important thing here about civilizational continuity. I mean, let's face it, we are sitting here in the 21st century discussing this 4th century scholar. And so there is, obviously, today we have pride in him. But in the intervening period, I mean, there was obviously Kamandak in the Gupta period. But did you find other texts which explicitly mention Kautilya's books and discuss them in later times? Say in the Maratha Empire, or the, I don't know, whatever, Vijayanagar Empire or some such time.
Yeah, that's in fact my next sort of topic that I am researching upon, and so it's still a work in progress. But from whatever that I've read thus far, there are references even in in Rajaraja Chola and Rajendra Chola, the Chola Empire. There are references to to some of Kautilya's ideas, the Arthashastra's ideas.
But specifically to him?
Yeah, attribution to the text, yes, but not to Kautilya, I would say. I mean, I haven't seen any sort of evidence to directly attribute to Kautilya. I might be wrong again. My research on this subject is still nascent. But from whatever anecdotally that I've read, There are inscriptions, one which I have seen in Kambuja Desa, in books related to that. Another is in the Chola Empire, where there are references to the Arthashastra text and some of these ideas. But to be really honest, I've not. This is still a work in progress. Probably a year and a half later, I would be in a much better position to sort of, flesh that out a bit more.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. Why don't we get some questions going? May I ask the IT team who is listening in if they can flash any of the questions that have appeared here? While I'll keep the conversation going, but as soon as such questions pop up, please do type them out so that here we are. It's from Shubham Sharma. Should we understand the book as something limited in its contextual setting or principles that are universally applicable broadly?
Yeah, I think the two sets to the questions, right? One is limited in its contextual setting, principles universally applicable broadly. I think the principles are applicable. The conceptual frameworks, the ideas that Kautilya had, I wouldn't say all of them are applicable today, but there are definitely some of them which are applicable. The setting is obviously very different, but you need to also understand that, we are still humans. I mean, humans 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And humans have certain traits which underpin the sort of socio-political economy. So these attributes of human beings, which affect their choices, the consumer choices or their economic choices, you could still learn some of these ideas which were through these texts. So in that sense, while the advent of data, technology, and all these things have evolved much further in our times, I think that the human element is still something which we could it's a common denominator across both, and that is. So I would say some of the principles are applicable broadly, which can be used and for our times. But the setting is completely different in terms of the broader sort of environment.
So while we wait for the next question to pop up, there it is. Since the ideas are primarily dharmic, which rely on ethics of people, are there any prescriptions for economists of today? That's a fair question, since your book is about Kautilyanomics for modern times.
Yeah,
give a couple of specific examples of how you would make a policy today which would be different from what we would have derived from a conventional model.
No, let me put it this way. I find some of the policies today aligning to sort of what Kautilya would have done. So that's where the idea of dharmic nudges is something which I think it will be very useful.
Why don't you contrast it? That might be even more interesting. Not the alignment, but a difference. What he would have done, which would be different from if you had derived the same policy from today's principles.
Yeah. So let's take the issue of climate change, right? In today's times, what Kautilya would have, while he would have looked at regulations in terms of tax policy, carbon taxation, whatever it is, by the state, I think he would have recognized that it's fundamentally a behavioral sort of problem. If the society and people around the society do not acknowledge a wider need to protect the environment and the world, no matter what policy you sort of put it, especially in a country like India or Bharat, no matter what policy you sort of frame by the legislator, the success depends largely on how much the people's buy-in is on that particular initiative. And I think that's where he would sort of inculcate, some of these dharmic principles of Saucham, cleanliness, of Vasudeva Kudumbakam, the idea of,
Kautilya is quite severe when he decides that something needs to be done. I don't know what Kautilya's view on climate change would have been, but let's say he was convinced that this was an issue and you needed to do. He would have no qualms about using state power to make sure it happens. I don't think he would have a problem with that.
No, but I sort of, humbly slightly disagree there, in the sense that he would have done state power in terms of implementing that policy sort of ruthlessly, right? In terms of, if there are norms for a particular policy, if you don't follow those norms, he might have, been very critical of it, or made sure that you stick to it. But I don't think he's going to. I have not seen where he sort of manages the individuals to sort of do the day-to-day activities or whatever it is. Something as fundamental as climate change is something which is an output of our day-to-day activities. So I think my sense is he would sort of appreciate this element more compared to the assumptive power of both the state and the monarchy.
Ashokan approach to things, where you send the Dharma Mahamantas to make sure you listen to whatever he's doing.
Well, that is, again, see, triggering a consciousness is different from implementing or imposing something. I don't think Kautilya it imposes his agenda. For example, in the text, he mentions in many places that he doesn't believe in superstitions. He doesn't. There's no concept of religion at all in the text, except for the idea of dharma. In the sense that
No, I'm saying that it's interesting that he could contrast it with Ashoka, who would send his Dharma Mahamantas to sort of almost impose whatever it is he was trying to do.
Correct. So that's where I sort of, I sort of try to show the difference, because I think what Kautilya would have preferred is to sort of get it naturally, or bring the consciousness naturally to people, and then look at ways to do that. Whereas I think the Ashokan approach is what you had sort of mentioned, with more of imposition of ideas.
So we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll hand it back to Amish if he's still around, and to close this. So let me see if there's any more questions, but are there any other questions that are there? But while we wait for the question, let me say that, the thing here is, is there a sort of tradition? I think the question here is also fits with what I'm going to ask. As an economist, why would you choose the Arthashastra or any other ancient or modern text? And the point is, of course, I mean, what we are trying to see here is to look at a tradition of Indian thought. And that's what the Arthashastra is. What we are trying to do is to explore an earlier era of thinking about various issues, some of which we still face, and to sort of create a chain. So the question here is, why would you choose the Arthashastra? Do you think that there has been or should be a tradition of writing periodic Arthashastras for every era? Or do you think that, because this book is actually quite a peculiar kind of book. It's very comprehensive. It does not do what many economists of today will do, is divide these various subjects into small bits and sort of get into the detail. It's a real comprehensive book. I mean, it's got everything from urban design to how to arrange your military camp in there. So do you think today it would be possible to write a book like that? Because, maybe a simpler time at the beginning, you can write these kinds of grand sort of manuals. Do you think it's even possible to write a manual like this today?
Yeah. I think the question really is, why this book? I mean, this book, because this is probably the most talked about, text in terms of our, geopolitical discourse on, say, ancient India. So that's primarily the reason why this book, why I focused on this one. But answering the question of the reader, of the listener, so I think there are variety of other texts, Niti Shastra, for example, the Dharma Shastra itself, and even our ancient epics, which could all have an undercurrent of, say, materialistic living and the ideas that were proposed. So, variety of areas to explore, which haven't been explored. So the idea is to get this debate on the table, so that people like Sanjeev, and others sort of discuss, debate, critique, come up with say 10 other books, because you can't have for all the talk on the Arthashastra. This is probably the second or third book that focuses on economics in the Arthashastra, which is amusing to say the least.
Yeah, in fact, you're absolutely right. There's just so many books about the Arthashastra. Almost all of them somehow go down into this geopolitical mandala theory kind of stuff, which is almost a passing thing that he discusses in one chapter. The rest of the book is really much more on governance than on spies.
No, there's a reason why it's called the Arthashastra, Sanjeev. We could have called the Rajya Shastra or the Rashtra Shastra.
Yeah.
He one of Kautilya's biggest, gifts to the world is that he sort of believed that economic prosperity is the foundation for political success. And that's how the text, that's the focus of the text, of the title of the text itself, right? So while you have all these strategic elements and all these other contours, his fundamental philosophy was unless there's prosperity in the kingdom, you're not going to achieve any of the other objectives, right? So the idea is to get more information of what he defines and what is his thinking on this prosperity. So I would say that much more text to sort of explore and look at. And on your point on sort of a generalist, whether this can be done today, you're right. In today's times, you need far more specialization, far more sort of intricacies. But I also have a section on something called the Tantra Yukti, which is a sort of a technique which is used in ancient texts, especially the Ayurveda and the Arthashastra, to sort of extract the text in its own tatparyam, the intent of the text. So the way these texts have been structured, some of them are not aligned to our level of understanding in today's times. So there could be another translation with subject matter experts which could redefine some of these ideas 10, 15 years down the line, because a lot of these texts, the translations are done by really generalists. When specialists come into the picture, it could give us a different outcome. So that is also something fascinating, I would say.
So for some of the audience to take up, maybe taking up these texts and actually attempting to translate them end to end. So if there's some budding economists who also know Sanskrit and have an interest in doing it, here is an opportunity to do some really cutting edge work. So with that, I'll bring this to a close. Let me hand it back to Amish, anybody from Nehru Center, if he is there, before we close this. Okay, so I think whatever reason Amish is unable to join us, what we will do is we'll close it here. Unless there is another question. Okay, so this is just somebody thanking you, Sriram. So let me bring this to a close, and once more, let me congratulate you for an interesting book and for an interesting conversation, and the very best of luck for marketing this. I believe you are in India for the next 6 weeks or something like that, traveling around. So hopefully you will be able to take this conversation around, and when we meet next, you'll be able to give me a sense of what were the different kinds of reactions you had to this book. So congratulations.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Really appreciate your support. You've been a pillar of strength for my works for a long time, and I've always appreciated that. I want to acknowledge, without the likes of people like Sanjeev, who his books on maritime history, on a variety of other topics, people like me wouldn't be sort of engaged in this in such a sort of compelling manner. So just wanted to thank you again for everything, and I look forward to meeting you soon in your new office and house.
Okay, see you there.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Sure.